was alone sitting in a hut, and I said my goodbyes to family, and I prepared to transition, and I just sort of faded out and assumed that that would be my last breath. Actually, I did wake up the next morning, but everything was much more vibrant, and life was so colorful in such a deeply more profound way, and the sounds were so intense. And the message was, by worrying about dying, I'm not living.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Field Tripping. Joining us on the podcast today is a person who has, in many ways, done more to advance access to psychedelics than anyone else through his movement and organization, Decriminalize Nature. It really is nice to connect one-on-one. We've shared some emails, and I'm certainly familiar with Decriminalize Nature over the years. But in preparing for this podcast, it seems like I'm not going to call you a total newcomer, but you're a relative newcomer to the world of psychedelic entheogens and beyond, at least in the research I found. I would love to hear your story up until kind of the discovery of entheogens in your life.
Hi, Ronan. So first, thank you very much for having me here. And we did exchange some kind of fascinating emails. And so I do appreciate you inviting me to come and speak today. And so in terms of my own involvement in plant medicine, it's pretty recent. I had my first experience in October of 2018, but my life really has been one long psychedelic journey, if you will. Starting from a young age of 7 years old, I had a profound experience with the death of a loved one, and it sent me into this deep obsessive process of trying to understand what death meant relative to life, but also the infinite, because I was told that they would go to heaven, raised Catholic. And so it sort of sent me spiraling into trying to understand what the infinite was, what nothing was, zero, and what this existence in this finite plane really was all about. So the cost of that was a lot of sleepless nights. I finally reconciled that at least my ability to have a good night's sleep at around the age of 20, 23. But the upside was that that I was able to live my life from a profound place of understanding that it wasn't, my time was short on this planet, so I better make the best of it, which enabled me to kind of get through some of my childhood trauma, some of the things that plagued some others in my community, including gang violence and street violence and incarceration, hopelessness. I really sought to live life to its fullest. So I spent a lot of my time just trying to put myself in situations that would expand my awareness in that moment. So going to college, first one in my family, first amongst my friends, was really me trying to expand my understanding of the world. My degree is in biology and anthropology, my bachelor's. But I took a trip into the Ecuadorian rainforest. By way of example, I did that. I lived as a hunter-gatherer for 3 months for when I was 23 years old. And the intention there was, really, again, just to blow my own mind, disrupt my understanding of reality. And then 6 months later, when I was in the rainforest, actually, I learned about being accepted to Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, where I got my master's. So within 6 months of being in the rainforest and watching people live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and walking through the halls of Yale University and hearing about the life of very privileged and wealthy people relative to hunter-gatherers. And those kinds of extremes are what I've tried to do to disrupt my reality and immerse myself in cognitive dissonance so that I can then come up with a narrative that is more expansive. And that's been a pattern in my life of doing those kinds of things. In many ways, I've lived a psychedelic life with a number of journeys in my life, and really just trying to get the most that I could out of life. But it was the mushroom journey that I had in 2018 that really launched me in terms of understanding how to disrupt my understanding of reality in that moment. And so I became a advocate of these medicines being liberated, particularly for communities from which, for example, from which I came, which don't know about or didn't know about these plant medicines growing up, where we were taught they were largely, illegal drugs, would kill you, would put you in prison. And so it became my mission to get the word out primarily for marginalized communities and share the word. unique thing here is that I come from Mexican background, and we know that Mexico is a country very rich with entheogenic use history. An irony there is that our own medicines were no longer available to us, and we were going to prison. Our people were going to prison for considering using them. And so that this is part of the reason why I've spoken strongly about no limits to prevent incarceration of people in marginalized communities.
Thank you for sharing that. So many questions come out of that. So did I hear you right? There was a death in your family or someone close to you at the age of 7, and you basically had sleepless nights until the age of 23. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah. So I began obsessing. It was actually, I remember the night, like it was yesterday, where I was introduced to the concept of, when I asked a family member, where did so-and-so go when they died? And the response was, they went to heaven where they will live forever. And then I started to try to conceptualize forever. And it just sent me down the rabbit hole every night thereafter until the age of 23. And it's an interesting story how I overcame that obsession. But every night I would lay down and not fall asleep until 1 or 2 or 3 in the morning, until I just exhausted myself from trying to figure out what infinity was relative to the finite, relative to zero or non-existence. And this was just my nightly obsession, trying to make sense of that. But I was finally able to get over it through a near-death experience I had in the rainforest, actually.
First of all, were you a particularly precocious kid? Because I look at my 6, almost 7-year-old, and I don't see him obsessing over it. Of course, God willing, he doesn't experience a traumatic death anytime soon for people close to him. But that's a very big intellectual, spiritual, philosophical bite to chew on as a 7-year-old. Was this kind of consistent with your personality, or is this kind of an awakening?
It was an awakening. I don't know why it happened. I assumed it happened to everyone. I would ask my cousins, do you obsess with death? And they would look at me like I was weird. Certainly it is something that happened to me at that age because of the introduction of death and the infinite in one day. And I don't know how many other people obsess about that, but it certainly became my obsession. But the upside of that really, again, was, then I started looking at major decisions in my life from there forward. Now, as a 7-year-old, you don't have a lot of major decisions, but when I became a teenager and I had to, my friends dropped out of high school at junior year, my choices in life were always guided by, one foot in the grave. One day I will have my last breath. How do I want to live this moment relative to that? And that was always my guide for important decisions. And I think if you look at the trajectory of my life, particularly given the challenges that I had growing up, I think, people like me were supposed to not go to college or university, but they were influenced by that particular perspective of looking back at life and understanding that it is this miraculous thing that is not long lasting. It will be over soon. And so there's just this embrace of life. And I think that's also one of the reasons I fell deeply in love with nature, is just the beauty of it all, and became an advocate of conservation biology, of environmental stewardship at a young age.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm very curious to hear what happened at the age of 23. But before we get there, I'm curious to know, were you able to reconcile these thoughts about zero and the infinite and life? Like, what were some of the insights? I'm presuming that since your first experience with entheogens in 2018 or whenever it was, that exploration has probably continued and evolved and all that kind of stuff. But from 7 to that moment, like, how did you reconcile that? If you can share it. I mean, these are conversations that really start to lean into the ineffable. But I'm always learning, wanting to learn more about people's perspective on this and how they understand it. Again, if there's anything to share, I don't know if there's something that's easily translatable into this conversation, but
pretty straightforward. The reconciliation with zero, the infinite, and this moment of the finite that we're in I didn't find a path to reconciliation of that until the age of well, let's see, I would have been 48 when I had my first mushroom experience. I'm sorry, 50,
okay,
actually. And that was in 2018. The mushroom experience and the reason it was so profound is because it offered me a reconciliation of a lifelong struggle with reconciliation of zero, the infinite, and our moment of finite in between. And I'm happy to kind of speak to that, what happened in that journey. The near-death experience that I had in 1993 was in the rainforest. I was not a very good hunter-gatherer, and so I was losing a lot of weight, and but I was living with a tribe, big on sharing food because the oil companies had come in and they had disrupted the ecosystem, and so the native folks, the Ashwad in this case, had largely depleted their meat resources, and so food was a very scarce thing. Particularly meat resources were a scarce thing, so they would save it for their families. So I was pretty hungry, and we were visiting some folks and in a nearby tribe, and I was offered food, but it was kind of some older food. Without making things too gross, there was like maggots in there with fish, and so I ate it because I was hungry. Well, it didn't settle well. So that night I had a pretty intense fever, got up to 104, and I pretty much said my goodbyes to family. I was alone, sitting in a hut, and I said my goodbyes to family, and I prepared to transition, and I just sort of faded out and assumed that that would be my last breath. When I did wake up the next morning, but everything was much more vibrant, and life was so colorful in such a deeply more profound way, and the sounds were so intense that and the message was, by worrying about dying, I'm not living, and I need to just let it go. So it was more about suppression than it was about reconciliation. What plant medicines have since shared with me is that there are narratives that help us reconcile any paradox or any paradox we may carry in our stories, and that those narratives are narratives of peace. When we have a situation where we have something that needs to be reconciled, we learn something new, right? One of the journeys that people have, suddenly they realize, I am God, not meaning I am the God, but I am part of God. Then it's like, well, wait, how can I be God and a human at the same time? And then that creates this cognitive dissonance. And but then as you build the narrative, that narrative enriches your life. If you can build a narrative of reconciliation, it enriches your life. So what happened on that mushroom journey and then journeys subsequent to that is I found narratives that allowed me to weave together all of the paradoxes in my life and bring reconciliation to all of it, including zero and the infinite, and create a story that allows me to live with peace. But really what it is, it's a story. Obviously, I have no way of proving it other than my inner knowing. But I think that is sometimes what causes us grief, depression, is those internal paradoxes that cause us distress.
Can you share that internal story that has helped you reconcile it?
Sure. Yeah. So the mushroom journey, again, I suppressed it in 1993 when I was in the rainforest. I suppressed the obsession with death so I could live and fully. But then in 2018, when I had my mushroom journey and I went in, it was not my intention to reconcile that. I suppressed it enough. But my mother had died, and my father had died. 5 other family members had died. So it was still sort of lingering there, all within a short period of a few years of each other. So it was all lingering there in a suppressed state. I had done a lot of meditation the 2 years previous. I was doing 2 hours a day of meditation, trying to get to the other side of the finite. I had reached the void, where just peacefulness in the sense that nothing is real, but it's all real, but it's all meaningless. So cosmic nihilism. That's the state I had reached. And so I didn't really have a lot going on in my head. It was a lot of silence, but without meaning. And then I had my mushroom journey, sort of this openness to receive whatever came. And what came to me was the infinite. It was a higher voice. Some call it spirit, the higher self, God, whatever. But it wasn't me as this me in physical form. It was much wiser than I am. And it showed me this sort of infinite fractal with no beginning, no end. It's just us, collective us, emerging into unawareness from awareness. So original awareness, fractalizing out into greater complexity, and then going into the darkness or the unawareness, that which we fear, but we're sort of life living up against that. And it said, "You are there." And it pointed to a place in the fractal, and it said, "This is you. And if you live from love, you help create life. If you live from fear, you help senesce life. And our purpose for being here is to live, to express life, the beauty of life." And what helped me reconcile all of that was the showing me the infinite, that there is no beginning, no end. And so the idea that we're trying to find how something came from nothing is a meaningless experiment, because it didn't. It's always been here. We're of the tribe of something, not of the tribe of nothing. So we don't have to, destroy our minds trying to reconcile that. It's unreconcilable. But the other thing is that this moment in time is our sort of moment in time to live and be a part of this grand existence. The transition, which we call death, that's also part of the experience. So it just helped me reconcile all of that.
Man, that's a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that. I have no idea what you actually experienced, but I was imagining it in my head as you were telling it, and it was really cool. So thank you for sharing that. I know we came here probably to talk a little bit more about decriminalized nature and advocacy and let's call it the politics around that. But I do have one more question, which was actually two questions. One is, you grew up. Let me start with this one. What was it like being a hunter gatherer? Like, that is a big leap. And kudos to you for having, I don't know, the courage or the stupidity or both to do that. But curious to know what it was like.
Tremendous. For an East Side kid from East San Jose, poverty, our greatest experiences on vacation were going to the Grand Canyon. Like, we didn't have a lot of things to mess with our reality other than the stuff in our neighborhoods. To be in that situation with hunter-gatherers, and I had studied anthropology and wanted to really understand life and humans and our relationship to the planet at UCLA. So being in that situation was really a dream, but it was actually a dream that I had as even a small child. Just obsessed with life. The intensity of life of the rainforest was one aspect of it, and it was really tremendous to walk through the rainforest quietly, trying not to disturb the animals, to be a hunter. And I remember walking through the rainforest with folks from there, from the Ashwad tribe, kind enough to take me in and bring me along. And when they walked through the rainforest, they walked with such grace that you couldn't even hear a leaf crack. And then here I come, and it sounds like, a Sasquatch walking through a forest, my feet just thudding on these because I wasn't experienced in it. So just the level of sophistication that it took to be a hunter-gatherer, the intergenerational experiences that are passed on, the understanding that they had about every plant. I could point to something, they could tell me a use almost universally, or don't use it, or this is what we combine it with. Just such a deep, rich understanding of the rainforest as a community that they were in, which really, for me, solidified my approach to the world as more of an ecosystem approach to living, as opposed to a scientific reduction approach to living, which is what I was trained in biology: reduce to understand. Here, they understood things in context of everything else in an interrelated way. And so it just really brought that forward for me. In terms of the actual living the life of a hunter-gatherer, probably won't make a career out of it because I was not the least bit successful. It just takes too much skill for someone from East San Jose to develop in a short period of time. So, I lost 30 pounds before I left in 3 months. But it was beautiful. I mean, it was absolutely the most enriching experience of my life, and in and of itself, a truly psychedelic experience, if by that we mean pulling ourselves into a different dimension of reality and experiencing it fully. That's absolutely what it was.
Did you leave because you were losing too much weight, or were you just kind of committed to a 3-month journey there?
I was committed to a 3-month period, which is probably good, because if I would have stayed longer, I would have continued to lose weight. I had my ticket already bought to leave 3 months later.
So 2018, you have... Oh, sorry. Before you focused on psychedelics, I was reading that you were part of the decrim and legalization movements around cannabis as well. How did that enter the picture?
Yeah, so that was very educational for me. I was part of a lot of mistake making that I learned from. Starting as early as 2002, the council office that I worked in, we were the ones responsible for setting the trend of setting limits on cannabis, as we were passing legislation to decriminalize or legalize, really, a regulated framework for dispensaries or collectives at the time. And then it just became more and more and more of putting regulations and limits, limiting number of permits, limiting amounts, and very constraining regulations. And so I was part of that. And then I became a lobbyist advocating for the very same things in cannabis from 2008 to 2013. 2014, I actually had a couple cannabis businesses that we sort of let go because they became just so dark, competitive, greed driven that I just had to step away from it. But it was a really important lesson in the things that went wrong in legislating a new emerging thing that grows from the ground, such as plant medicine, cannabis. And so when I had that plant medicine experience with mushrooms and then ayahuasca, DMT, and then later with peyote, it really was such a profound experience that I thought, wow, how do you put this in a capsule and put someone in a therapeutic clinic? I mean, certainly there's space for that, but how do you do that and allow someone to have that kind of expansive experience who might be, say, from deep East Oakland, let's say a 22-year-old young man who was raised in violence and trauma and deserves to have an awakening experience, if that's what they want of this kind? How do you contain that in a pill or an office? And I just couldn't get there from there. It's just too much. So that's where it was like, okay, we cannot follow the cannabis model on this if we're going to liberate people. We have to try something new. And so the idea was, well, let's start with a model of abundance, make sure everyone get access, and go from there.
Was your involvement with cannabis, and I'm going to ask a question about the clinic and abundance thing, but was your involvement with cannabis just because you happened to be involved with council at the time, or was that something that you had been passionate about at the time?
So I started smoking cannabis at the age of 12.
Okay.
And then pretty heavily through high school, and it was largely to sedate and self-medicate. Yep. But then to get to college, I stopped, focused on trying to get through school. So when my council office found itself right in the center of it, because my boss was the president of the Oakland City Council, and sort of all things went through his office, and I was one of his legislative aides. It was just one of those things where, oh, this is cool. Like, I have a relationship with cannabis. It probably saved my life growing up by helping me find a different way than the violence I saw around me. And now I get to help make it legal. But we just didn't know, right? So none of us, we thought we were doing good by liberating it and legalizing it. But in retrospect, that the lessons were in what we could have done better to minimize what's happening now with the some of the struggles that are out there.
Okay, I'll circle back to that because I do want to focus on Decriminalize Nature, and so tell us about how Decriminalize Nature came to be. You had this experience with psilocybin in 2018, and at least from what I read in preparing for this conversation, shortly thereafter, the idea for the movement came to life. But tell us about that.
Yeah, so I had that experience and that I shared with you, and the next day I was in awe, and then a couple of days later I was pissed off. Why did it take so long for me to have this experience? I wish I would have had it at 14 and had a lot more well-slept nights. But it was such an intense experience that I began to look for community, because I really wanted to understand what happened to me coming from a science background physiologically. So I read a great study about from UC Davis, the research that was done about the impact of psilocybin and LSD, DMT on the neural system, particularly the axons and the dendrites and the growth of those. And so I began to really try to make sense of this, the science, as well as what does it mean, implications for society, and started going around talking to community. And I went to a seminar in the Bay Area about entheogens and their prevalence in our communities, even ones that we don't know are entheogens or have entheogenic capabilities, like star jasmine, for example. And it was done by a particularly well-read person and scientist who gave a presentation. Turns out that person was part of this larger psychedelic community in the Bay Area. So I told him I had come out of legislation. I told him I was interested in seeing what we could do to help advance the cause. He called folks together. I was brand new in it. I didn't know anyone. He called folks together. It ended up being 12 people sitting around a table at a building that I owned at the time. And we talked about what should we do here. And someone, Dr. Gary Kono, actually, to give him credit, said, I think we should do a decriminalization effort. And so I said, okay, well, I can help with that. And then we decided a resolution was the best course. And then from there, it sort of just the wave caught us. And it was almost as if we were caught in this current that needed to happen. We were just riding the raft. It was happening so fast that we could barely keep up with it. This is going through the Oakland City Council. And within 5 months, we're, unanimous approval of this. So it was really intense. And then after that, we had just thousands of people reaching out to us who wanted to start chapters in their local area. A group of us from that original group. Many of those were underground space holders. They chose to stay underground, understandably so. Others, myself and Larry Norris, who's the co-founder and one of the main activists in Decriminalize Nature nationally, decided we wanted to help take this nationally. And so we just took our model, we gave it away, we gave everything away, and we supported people in building out their own Decriminalize Nature efforts in their local cities.
What were the foundational principles of Decriminalize Nature when it got founded, other than to achieve decriminalization? And how has that evolved between then and now?
So 3 of us sat around, as we knew we were going to do something, we sat around a table, there was 3 of us, and we asked the basic question, at the core, what are we? And, we stripped everything away and we said, well, we are what the message is, love. So, but then what does that mean when you're translating love into policy? And that's where we came up with equitable access. So everybody, regardless of income, should have access to these medicines and to the education and information necessary and to the space holding community support systems that are necessary. So equitable access became a core principle. And then the others were that we're focusing on nature, those medicines that come from nature. And it wasn't because we were discriminating against synthetics. It was because we saw something really sacred about this planet and our relationship of our ancestors with nature to produce these plants and fungi that have these deep, profound consciousness experiences that we said, the very least, let's really push to decriminalize these because it's nature. And then from these, we can then build to have bigger conversations about decriminalizing synthetics that impact consciousness. But that's a much more mature and sophisticated conversation to have because the amount of synthetics that can be produced is almost endless. So, and their impacts are, can be all over the place. So we have to get to the point where we can have a conversation about consciousness. But first, let's have a conversation about nature. And so then other principles included transparency, because we wanted to speak truth and be about truth and openness. The other was decentralization. Let's not try to control. Let's let people just roll with it. And then open source. Let's just give everything away. So those were the primary principles.
And have those principles changed? 2 questions. Have those principles changed since the founding, or are they consistent? I imagine they're consistent, but maybe have expanded. And secondly, has the open sourcing and decentralization gone as you had hoped, or have there been challenges with that?
So still the same principles. That's an easy question. Very much the same. We have an organizer's handbook on our website that it's been the same handbook, same principles for 3.5 years. In terms of has it gone, this one of the most wonderful things about this experience, as challenging as it's been, in terms of seeing my own shadows as an opportunity to see my own shadows, has been very challenging. But I embrace it. One of the amazing things has been just to see human nature unfold as a new economy, a new industry potential unfolds into human awareness. And to sort of sit on the tip of the arrow and watch that happening has really taught me a lot about human nature. Ideally, and I really try hard to come from a place of compassion and not judgment. If I do come from judgment, it's my own shadow speaking. But it's been fascinating to watch the struggles with people, as even our own leaders struggle with. Is this my opportunity to make money? Is this my opportunity to get fame? Is this my opportunity to satisfy some need of my ego? And that's a constant struggle for, I think, humans. So no different here. It's just been fascinating to watch as our movement has expanded into uncharted territory.
I don't know if you can or want to, but can you elaborate on, that a little bit? Because I can totally see that, and I'll just be very transparent. One of the thoughts that I've been thinking about recently, which is probably germane to some of the sort of more political advocacy kind of conversations, is that our whole society has been built on the pursuit of what I'd call power and money. And for most of human history, the pursuit of power and money was necessary for survival. Organizing, making sure that we're not the inadequate hunter-gatherers trying to get food when we're not actually equipped to do so in the rainforest kind of thing, and working in a culture to ensure survival. But we've kind of gotten pretty close to a point in the operations of the planet that survival for most is pretty well assured. Not all by any stretch, but for most people, survival is pretty much a given these days. And so it invites the question of, if survival is a given, do we need a society that's architected towards power and money, which were the focus when survival was not a question? And so something I've been struggling with, not struggling with, but thinking about. It's one of those things that keep me up at night these days, being like, how do we reconsider everything if we change that fundamental assumption about what's valuable in our society? So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if that can be reflected back to, the shadows emerging, or seeing, the shadows of like, oh, I can be famous. Oh, I can make money, all that kind of stuff. Because I think all of that is precipitated on inherently the still high value we put on power and money.
Love it. Yeah, no, I have quite a bit to say about that, but I'll do my best to keep it synthesized into a somewhat short statement. So helping lead a movement of abundance and compassion and cooperation into a country that is really the belly of the beast of extractive capitalism, and which has really been for the last 50 years operating under this rubric of corporate expansion into the world, really as a way of spreading hegemonic control over paradigms. And I get it, right? We all come into this world, and what we want even more than freedom is order. So what better way to create order than to have everyone in the world speaking the language I speak, or seeing the world through the prism through which I see? Because then it creates a world that's a reflection of me. And that's the logic behind some sort of the globalization, corporate expansion around the world, which is a more acceptable way than military, domination, which has gone out of vogue now. And so we live in the belly of that beast. And by the way, I run a building company. I'm fully immersed in capitalism, but I understand its dark underbelly as well. And so organizing abundance and compassion model into that with the intention to transform the human experience towards more love and compassion in the world through these very powerful plant medicines has been really eye-opening. And because, again, not from a place of judgment, but from compassion, most people then, as a result of living within the belly of the beast, come from a place of scarcity, which is, I need to pay my bills. There's so much competition for resources that sometimes becoming famous or well-known or expanding your number of friends on Instagram, et cetera, is a good way of building security for yourself that, I have some hope for survival in this. And even though we're not living hand to mouth out there trying to find fruit from a wild tree or wild berries anymore, we still are in that scarcity mindset where working for $15 an hour in many places in the U.S. is no longer feasible. So people are still struggling to make ends meet very much. and people don't want to be in that. And so it is challenging for people. And so a lot of our leaders around the US have been challenged with that decision making, that crossroad where it's, I can now have that opportunity I've been waiting for using my trajectory with DN, or I could stay the course of compassion, abundance, and not seek to personally, financially benefit from my position here. That's a tough thing for people. And I think, holding compassion for people like that, people who have to make that decision is the only way to do it without getting endlessly frustrated. I understand that I have resources at my disposal that others may not, so I have to hold compassion. And we lose just as many leaders to that moment in time as we keep.
Right. Is there a way to reconcile that, though? Is there a, if I go back to the fundamental thesis of neoliberal economics and Western values and all that kind of stuff, it's the trickle down effect. It's you raise everybody else up by raising yourself up. And we've seen that hasn't worked exactly as planned. But at the same token, there are less people in poverty worldwide. There's less people hungry worldwide. So there's been some of that. And I think we're just running up against the limits of that because it's come at the sacrifice in many ways of meaning and purpose. It's like, are we just here to consume? Is that all I'm here to do, is gather resources, keep as much as I can, pass it along to my kids, and that's a successful life. But is there a way to reconcile that between that desire, that drive, and still having, compassion, abundance, love?
I believe there is. And, our movement really said, we don't know, we want to decriminalize, just make these not illegal to grow, gather, gift, and just let it be abundant in our society for personal use. But we always knew, okay, what comes next in terms of commerce? And where I think we've made mistakes as a movement is then when we get to that question, we feel compelled to fit it into an existing model, which again, if you're trying to fit it into an existing model, which is already a framework for extractive capitalism, then you're going to get what you get. But on the other hand, if you're okay with kind of gray area, and this is what we share with folks, is yes, there's going to be people doing things in these communities that are sort of pushing the margins of legality or sometimes going way beyond that line. And let's for a moment just be okay with gray as we work through in these communities like Oakland, like Ann Arbor. What does a good local commerce economy look like? So what we're doing here in Oakland and San Francisco, these two cities have joined forces, and leading the charge are particularly female healers. These are underground healers, come from lineage or Black, brown underground communities, and therapists who are Western trained joining together and saying, hey, how do we build policies of commerce around healing people? And so you'll get that kind of creative energy flowing if you everybody can just take a breath and relax with gray area for a little bit and then see what emerges, which is much more natural in terms of ecosystem approaches. It's much more natural to do that rather than like slapping on some rubric onto an ecosystem that's emerging, right? And saying this is the way it must be. And I'm really inspired by the work of economists like Jeremy Rifkin, by futurists like Tony Seba, who runs Rethink X, who are recognizing that we are in this moment of technological disruption, particularly around energy, transportation, information, food, and materials. And as all of this disruption occurs, what's going to happen is the local is going to be much more empowered to find local solutions to global crises, be it climate change, be it housing. And we see that happening real time, not just with solar and driverless vehicles and the production of much more sophisticated things with 3D computers, CNC machines that are pulling information off the internet for free and producing things, but also with housing. Here in California, housing is shifting towards decentralized, democratized housing, meaning that any homeowner can become solutions to the housing crisis by building greater density. And this is a movement that's been happening in California for 3 years. So I'm actually more optimistic now about the future of humanity than I've ever been in my life. And I think that's because of some of the thinking of people like Jeremy Rifkin, who are recognizing the moment that we're in for what it is, which is this massive disruption towards greater localized innovation, which you get back to plant medicine, going local economy. Yes, we want local economy to emerge, farmers markets, healing collectives, but then layering on top of that, therapeutic models, medical models, even global corporate models are fine, as long as you have that underlying fundamental abundance that comes with decriminalization and the creativity that flows from that.
Can I ask, and maybe it's still in the kind of rumination process, but when you're building a local commerce system on the rubric of, lineages, Black, brown communities, etc., how does that start to look different than commerce as most people understand it? Are there kind of tangible things you can point to so I can start to wrap my head around how that works, what it looks like? Because over the last couple of years, I've become a big believer in what Charlie Munger said, which is show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. And so I'm wondering, is it just a matter of changing incentives, or is there something deeper that has to shift?
I think it's something deeper that has to shift, and I think you have these plant medicines experiences, and one of the things that you start to realize is, wait, if I live from a place of trust, of goodness, trusting in goodness, I become more creative. Things flow better, as opposed to if I'm living from fear and needing to control. Building off a statement you made about, generally speaking, globally, we've become much more wealthier as human beings, much less tied to basic level survival. However, in a city like Oakland, which is representative of many cities, we have this really big disparity of wealth between our, marginalized communities of color, where 80% of homeless people, of which there's now like 15,000 homeless people in Oakland, 80% are Black, many of whom lived here in Oakland growing up. What's happening is that there is a giant disparity in where the wealth is going to. And so even though those communities may have better services relative to other people in communities, there's a massive differential, right? So let's take the Black community in Oakland in terms of healthcare, or brown community in Oakland in terms of healthcare, access to good services, access to safe neighborhoods, good housing. Still a big struggle, education being the worst amongst those. Our educational system in these communities is horrible, whereas the education in a wealthy community is, phenomenal. So it's that disparity that really is a big problem for humanity in general, because it's going to create more and more stress, more and more division, more and more need for controls, more and more incarceration. It's just not sustainable. So that's the problem with the idea that at the one fractal level, yes, things are getting better generally, but at another fractal level, they're getting worse. So if we look at Oakland with respect to healing, there are models, and I'll lift one up specifically since you asked for an example, coming out of Dr. Sean Jenright's work, where he describes persistent traumatic stress exposure. And he doesn't work with psychedelics, but he works with what's called the radical healing model, which is around particularly healing in the Black community. And he's well known. He's at San Francisco State University. So PTSD is different than PTSD, because PTSD is chronic trauma in your life nonstop. That's a different experience than an acute trauma experience, and it just creates a whole level of distrust about everything. And so how do you handle that? So he's come up with this whole model of healing that within community. So the radical healing model, which I think is a model example of how healing can happen in the psychedelic space. And by the way, CIIS, they have been receiving workshops from members from people in the Black community of Oakland who do radical healing models. And as I understand it, is one of the most popular workshops at CIIS for their psychedelic program. What it does is it says, let's start with information. Let's pull the community together. So 100 people go through our process, including young people. Again, this doesn't include psychedelics, but it can. And I'll show you how. So let's start with information, and then let's go from information. Now we take that and create education. So pamphlets and workshops and trainings. And then once we do the education thing, let's have a peak experience. Now it's sounding very familiar to a journey. Peak experience in the radical healing model might be you take families, you take them into the wilderness, and you talk about what happened to the Black community in the American experience, including slavery, the diaspora, the Black community, Tulsa, what happened in Tulsa, what happened with crack cocaine, and you basically just give a big bucket of truth over a weekend. And what it does is just creates this heavy, heavy experience that then has to be reconciled. So now you're seeing this is like a deep journey where you're like inundated with truth. And then you you end that experience, that trip into the wilderness with, okay, now let's have a conversation as community about how we reconcile this with living well in our own communities today. And so you have that begins the reconciliation process. And then you go into integration, not just as the individual, but as community. And this is what's different than the psychedelic, therapeutic medical model, is integration happens on the community level. So, I'm Bob and I live in that community, and my parents, are no longer around, and I'm 19 years old and I don't have many job opportunities, and I've had a lot of violence. Where do I go? Right. So now I have this community I can be a part of. If you consider that within the context of a psychedelic experience, that feeling of being alone now that I've woken up, you're held in community. Mm-hmm. And then the last piece is reciprocity. So it's integration, then community integration, and then it's reciprocity. Now, how do I give back to those coming behind me? That's the healing process that we know well of in psychedelic space. They're doing it and have been doing it for 30 years in the Black community of Oakland in that format. But now some of the leaders who are taking adults through healing processes with psychedelics are using it to inform the entire psychedelic experience, so that people aren't left to feel alone and abandoned after they have that awakening moment with psychedelics. These are examples. So if you take that and you build commerce around that, you can start to imagine, okay, who's growing all these medicines? Where's the retreat centers? Who's paying for it? How much is being paid for the retreats? All these businesses that can begin to emerge just with that experience introducing these plants. And I think we have a lot to learn, not just from the Black community, but from Indigenous community in urban and rural areas, and all communities, really. So in every community offering their own interpretation of some version of that based on their own community dynamics is what we have to learn from a bottom-up approach based in community. But again, it's just being comfortable with gray area, because it's all going to be fluid, dynamic, messy.
Thank you for sharing that. It makes a ton of sense to me. And it's actually, in many ways, I think, the impetus for this conversation, which was, I had posted something online, which in subsequent conversations with you and Lucas and all that kind of stuff was taken out of context. But one of the things I've struggled with since I've been part of this, I'll call it movement, is it feels like people are trying to jam, Indigenous lineage and reciprocity down your throat. And if you don't, kowtow to that, then you're doing it wrong or anything along those lines. And I certainly have felt like that force of like, this is how you have to think. And it's what, my reaction was and all that kind of stuff. And this is the first time anyone's ever explained it to me, being like, oh, I get that now. Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Now I can be invited into that conversation. Whereas for a lot of the conversation, it doesn't feel like there's an opportunity to actually be informed and educated and understand it. Because for some people who start this process, they may go through it and not be ready to give back. Maybe they'll get there. And that's like, that ambiguity has always been the struggle between like, maybe people aren't there yet. Or do we have compassion for that? Or do you have to accept, this part of the equation? And that's where I get, that's where my shadow pieces come up and I get uncomfortable and be like, whoa, let's stop pushing that so hard for people who aren't ready to hear it. So all that's to say, thank you for explaining that.
Well, I'd love to riff off of that, Ronan. And first of all, I just want to say that when you posted that, it did. I was, this is a tough gig to be out here pushing for this position. I make no money, right? This is all volunteer, and it's a tough gig to be the target. I get shots, I get criticisms, not just from people who are in the private, profiteering side. I get criticisms from people who are of Indigenous ancestry, accusing me of not being Indigenous enough because I don't follow certain ways of being Indigenous, despite the fact that my people paid very high prices for being Indigenous, including being the lowest people in the economic totem pole in America of picking the fruit everyone else eats. So I get a lot of flack, and so when I read it, I was triggered. And what you got was my shadow, and I want to thank you for having so much grace in how you handle my shadows, sincerely. And that's why we're here. So kudos to you for that, and responding so well. I do want to say that what I described earlier as the radical healing models, and this one in the Black community, is not something that would be looked at favorably by many people in the indigenous community because it's not indigenous enough. Now, I come out of an urban area, and what I care about is I care about all humanity. What I have experience with, are the cholos, the vatos, the brothers, in the hood, in the barrio, like people who really are scraping to just get by in an urban setting. I'm not as familiar about living on a reservation, but I will, push very hard to make sure that people in an urban area are valued just as much as people on a reservation or people living in a mansion in the hills, because we're all human and we're all beautiful. So I have really taken some flack because I have said every human has a right to connect with their own indigeneity based on their ancestral paths. And while some of us may be more connected to our more recent indigenous paths than others, let's treat all of our indigenous ancestry, whether it was 2,000 years ago or 100 years ago or still today, with respect. And we have a lot to learn from the indigenous ways of healing. And when I say that, I mean specifically in America, the Wiharika, the Lakota, and others, but they're not the only ways, and they don't work for everybody. So we can give it reverence without being bullied or mandated into using that model for ourselves, because those models won't work in an urban area. They simply won't. It's not tangible culturally. There's no symbolism and meaning that would sort of be absorbed in the experience in an urban area. So I subscribe to a model that let's just everybody build the models that work for them in their own culture or for themselves, and let's all have reverence for each other, whether we are indigenous as like from the Americas or not, because we're all human. We're all in this path together. We all sink or swim together. We all survive together or not. That's not a very popular statement. I get a lot of crap for that kind of statement.
I get it. First of all, thank you for just recognizing the conversation that transpired between us. Again, I do send my apologies. I do recognize after the conversation how it could have been received in a way that I didn't want it to, and triggered a whole bunch of things. B, if I could reach to the computer and give you a fist bump right now, I would, because that's very much how I see the world, which is like we need to give respect for everybody where they are. And I'm Jewish. I was just chatting with my friend Daniel, who's also Jewish, and he had an ayahuasca experience, and he recognized that, his great grandfather, who was a rabbi, reading Torah, which to me sounds like the most insidious, boring, stupid thing to do, even though I'm Jewish, is like, that was my great grandfather's way of having these peak experiences. And I was like, oh, fuck, I never thought about that. So here I am kind of self-hating on like my lineage. And then I had a moment of like, oh no, I can have respect even for that, even though it was so alien and foreign and weird and uncool to me. All that's to say, I'm sorry you get flack for it. I do share your perspective of like, let's embrace all of it. Let's have respect for all of it and share without forcing, I think is what we should and can be doing. So thank you for saying all that.
Right on. Appreciate that.
You put a lot of thought into preparing for this conversation, and I wanted to make sure we spoke to that, which is, you came from with thoughts about the convergence happening in the advocacy community, and that before that there was a lot of divergence, how groups were approaching it. And I think we touched on it, just a shed here, but in an important way in our last couple of minutes. But can you please explain more about the thinking around that and what you wanted to share and the perspectives on it?
Yeah, so my role in coming into the movement, because I've been in politics and in a place like Oakland, it's very contentious politics. So, and I said this before publicly, we, on Tuesday night, councils were on Tuesday nights. It would be like trench warfare because everybody is fighting for scarce resources for their community. We're talking some very impoverished communities, some very wealthy communities, but everybody fights equally hard because their causes are all equally important. So Tuesday nights we're in trench warfare. Wednesday morning, we're having coffee together in the city hall break room, and that's policy making, right? So, and I think when I got into the psychedelic movement, that was my reference point. So my job was to shake things up, to get the mic to people who otherwise wouldn't have the mic, to push certain paradigms into the mainstream that otherwise wouldn't be there. Things like equitable access, abundance, the indigenous rights, the rights of Black, Brown, and urban communities, those kinds of things. And there wasn't a lot of dialogue around those when we first started. And then recently, I had this waking up moment because I stayed in those trenches. That was my role in Decriminalize Nature, was to constantly be throwing elbows and pushing things open and getting my way in, because I had good training in that, and I'm comfortable with conflict. And I want to say that it's conflict of paradigm and ideas, it's not personal conflict that I'm advocating here. So Bronner and I have banged heads together, but I'm sure he's a beautiful human being and just as worthy of love as I am, as I believe I am. And so there's no hard feelings, and it's not personal. But you do what you got to do to expand the conversation. So I woke up one day, because my role is, pushing, throwing elbows, whatever, being in the trenches. I woke up one day and I thought, who am I throwing elbows against now? And this is like in December, after Prop 1 and 22 passed, and I read it, and it's a great piece of legislation, in my opinion. And then I read SB 58, introduced here in California, subsequent to SB 519. And though it's not perfect and it still has limits, which Decriminalize Nature does not support, it's still a workable piece of legislation to protect everybody, including the most marginalized, if we just tweak a couple things. And then I saw Mason Marks coming out about the attempts in Oregon to take private data, and his efforts and the momentum he built around that. And I thought, we are in this moment of convergence, and I'm throwing elbows against clouds now, really, because I think we're all largely here. There's still some issues like peyote and limits that we got to tweak around to have conversation. But for the most part, everybody is now talking about these issues, not just talking about medical and therapeutic and profiteering, which was the big conversations being held early on 5 years ago. But now we're also talking about indigenous rights and the rights of Black, Brown, and even sexual assault in therapeutic clinics, as well as in shamanistic circles, that we need to deal with and be real about. All of it we're talking about now. And I realized we've reached this moment of convergence where now we ought to just sit down and figure out, tweak the 90% that we all agree on, figure out what to do with the 10%, put it aside for a moment. We still have work to do together. But really, we're not each other's enemies anymore. So if we get out the trenches, we walk to the center of the battlefield, and I use this kind of language because it's easy language for talking about policymaking. If we just walk to the center of the battlefield and we take stock, we'll realize, damn, we agree on a lot of stuff. And I'm not talking about like very conservative plant policy people that want full controls. I'm talking about New Approach Pack, Unlimited Science, Decriminalize Nature, your organization. We're all largely there. So how do we work together now again, and then push good policy and defend good policy like Prop 122, which may come under assault? Because the real adversaries on the horizon now is not each other. It's conservative thought relative to plant policy, right? That it has to be put in a capsule and that people shouldn't have access to growing it. Or it's also the big profiteers that want to align with that to make sure that we don't have abundance, because then they can sell more into scarcity. So, and I guess I want to take my lumps on that because, I stayed in the trenches maybe a little too long. I should have maybe got out in November, but it was just busy and hectic. But here I am now, ready to have these conversations with whoever's ready to have them about how we defend. Really, I think right now the big opportunity is defending Prop 122 together and building Prop 122 together in a meaningful way for implementation. But then on SB 58 is how do we ensure that everybody is protected under SB 58, because we're almost there, which is a little bit more dialogue.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. It's been my experience, and I don't have the totality of experience, but I feel like most people, even the people that would probably get flagged as being on the most conservative end of the spectrum, want to move to a system that we're talking about right now. I think it's just the checkerboard moves to get there, which is I supported what happened in Oregon. I can see how it's inconsistent with Decrim Nature, but the reason I supported it is not because I didn't want a path where there was as abundant access as possible, but because the Oregon model was something that was digestible to where the consensus is right now. And that kind of creates the wedge. So you get your foot in the door and then you can open it further. So I think there is a lot of alignment, even in the most conservative views. That's my perspective, but I absolutely share your perspective, which is I absolutely should be decriminalized. No one should be going to jail for this. People should have access. All of that is 100% true. It's just, what do we have to do to get the buy-in? Do we go for the Hail Mary pass and try and get it in the end zone in one play? Or do we try and take a more incremental approach? And my sense is that's probably where a lot of the disagreement lies, as opposed to the bigger goal.
I would say for those who live this world from a place of compassion, that's true. I think there are a lot of people, this is where I would diverge from that statement. There are a lot of people in this world who either live from a very heightened state of fear and will probably take that to their grave, and what they want are full controls to make them feel safe in this chaotic world. And top-down controls is the way they go, and we see that in even incarceration of people. Put those people in jail, they're just troublemakers, right? And you're talking about entire races of people that rhetoric comes from. And I think it's based in fear. And I'm not saying they're bad people. They're just in this heightened state of fear. And I think our society really promulgates that. But there's also the profiteering motive. I think there are people in the world who just really get off on making more and more money. And it drives them. It's fun. It's exciting. And that's the path they've chosen. And again, not evil people. They've chosen a path that means a top-down hierarchical structure of controls would win, and I can envision a world in the future, and so could others, especially science fiction writers, have envisioned a world where top-down controls are what happens to us inevitably. But then there's this other world where we're more like a flock of starlings. We move together in consciousness, where we trust and invest in the education of people in a decentralized, bottom-up approach to living, where we can enable the greatest creativity and fulfillment of life of all humans, without the need of these top-down, controls. So I think that both of those future realities for humans are equally real. The moment that we're in will determine which path we follow. But I don't necessarily think we all have the same motives of love and compassion. But that's not a judgment call. That's just more saying I don't think we've all achieved that state of being.
And I think it all starts with recognizing that they're not bad people necessarily. That is where they are right now and how they see the world. And if we could just all accept that, because I do feel like there's a lot of judgment still in the community. But if we get just a place where everyone's like, you're not a bad person, you see the world differently, and I have compassion for that, that's going to go a long way to facilitating conversation and exactly like this conversation here. That's a really beautiful note to end.
Absolutely.
That's the end of the questions I had prepared, and it's a beautiful note to end on. So I'm perfectly happy to put a nice bow on this conversation and package it up for a podcast. But I wanted to give you the opportunity, if there's anything you wanted to raise or wanted to ask me, I wanted to make sure we had opportunity for that as well.
I'm great. This has been a wonderful conversation with you. Again, really appreciate you stepping into it and being an example of how we can come together and have conversation. And hopefully more of these will follow with many people and we find common ground.
I want to thank you as well for taking the step, trusting us to have this conversation, making yourself honest and vulnerable. It's been great. I look forward to many more with you, actually. I hope this is the first of many. So I'm going to wish you continued best wishes for all the work you're doing with Decriminalize Nature. I want to thank you for it. I think it's incredibly important work, and we'll continue arm in arm in open dialogue as we continue to move forward.
Thank you.